702.
The Big Interview
With Bongani Bingwa.
It started as an informal economic survival tactic. It has now morphed into a violent and highly organized crime. It's driven, of course, by widespread unemployment. These are unregulated artisanal miners. We know them as zama-zamas. As I say, they are highly organized and they form into gangs that fight for turf. They've got automatic weapons and they fight to the death for abandoned shafts and territory. They place a number of civilian neighborhoods under enormous pressure. Residents will face things like extortion, armed robbery, physical assault, even sexual violence. Ask people in Riverlea, ask people in Kagiso, or even in Randfontein. And now government says it needs to stop because, as I say, there's a whole value chain around it. People recruiting miners, moving them, supplying them, buying minerals, and financing operations. And quite often when they've been caught in the past, they get away with a nominal fine. No more. New legislation proposes fines of up to 100 million rand and prison sentences for up to 30 years for certain offences. We are joined now by the Chief Director of Legislative Development and Implementation at the Department of Justice and Constitutional Development. This is Advocate Tsietsi Sebelemetja. A very good morning to you and welcome to our program.
Good morning and morning to the listeners.
There are huge gaps as the law currently stands, aren't there, between what legislation says and how illegal mining actually works?
Yes, definitely. And that is the reason why we had reviewed several pieces of legislation in the mining area and also the Criminal Procedure Act in order to make sure that the gaps that exist, we close them. And I think, as you started correctly by saying, this is mostly artisanal mining. And so there's been gaps that we realize that with what is happening, it's not actually the actual mining operations per se that brings about these challenges.
All right. What are some of the glaring gaps you've identified?
Yeah, for example, you'll realize that when you look at the piece of legislation in terms of your diamonds, mineral petroleum, they mostly will look at the operations that are big, but not necessarily your artisanal miners who go after closed mines, deal with them, but we'll be looking at what are those that are, proper mining operations. Therefore, that gap, you find that people that we arrest or that those are arrested find that mostly are foreign nationals. They'll be charged only with either trespassing or, being illegal in the country. And that will be the end of it. And those other ones, maybe the South Africans, you find that they're only charged with possession of unpolished diamonds, for example, and things like that. So then breaking down that gap is we are now coming up with these amendments to make sure that we are able to properly deal with those that are artisanal miners, as we call them, zama-zamas.
All right. Are there scenarios, I understand unauthorized artisanal miners or zama-zamas, but are there scenarios where there is authorization for this type of mining?
Yeah, I think that is part of what the Department of Minerals, this is one of the first part of the legislation that we are going to deal with, more particularly on the policing aspect, policing in terms of the police. But then with regard to the policy issues around artisanal mining and the like permissions, there's another bill that is coming. The department is at NETLEC with that, where artisanal mining will be properly regulated. And then people will be able to apply. And then then those that are not, those will be drilling or mining without the proper permissions, then will be purely illegal. So then there'll be that differentiation.
All right. How do we make sure that the proposals don't just nab the foot soldiers? In other words, the people digging underground who might themselves be even victims in some cases, as we have seen, of things like human trafficking. How do we not make sure that we only go after the small fish, if you will, and not the people, the big guys who are behind the scenes?
Yeah, I think firstly you start with those that are mining. Obviously, after mining, whatever they extract, they'll be handing over to other people that value chain, which is why the penalties move from about 250,000, because the big guys will be able to pay it as nothing. So if you look at an example of the amendments to the Diamond Act, we've increased the penalties from 250,000 to 100 million, necessarily because we know there are those who are dealing, those will be found in possession, and those will be doing the sale of unpolished diamonds. So that is meant to deal with those that are in the value chain after the extraction.
All right,
and then we should be able to... Yes.
Sorry to interrupt you. Take me through that value chain. Who gets fined what?
No. Remember, the law does not necessarily say if you are an artisanal miner, this is your penalty. It will then say if you are fined doing illegal mining, you may be fined from 250,000 to 100 million. So the scaling up will depend on the type of the offense that you would have committed in the value chain. So those will be extracting illegally, then you're found in possession or transporting, and then you are dealing, you're found to be doing a sale of unpolished diamonds. So there'll be a scale up. That's why it's up to 100 million rands.
I mean, just talk to me about the people who finance and who profit from these operations. I mean, we've seen at some mines where it's so brazen, they'll have these big machines that, authorized mining companies would ordinarily use, but they are so brazen in terms of how they get away with this. There's very clearly big money to be made here.
Yes, definitely. And I think that's part of why the police are then empowered with these amendments, will be empowered to deal more. And one of the amendments is to make sure that the Criminal Procedure Act in Schedule 1 then has the specific listing of a prohibition of illegal prospecting and mining activities, which are in the mineral petroleum, and as well the prohibition of those that are assisting those who are dealing or doing the zamazamas, basically, either in terms of provision of food and all the machinery that they will require to do that illegal. So this is all meant to cover them, so that in terms of the criminal procedure, as we arrest, we properly deal with them, because currently there's a bit of a gap.
I mean, I mentioned the issue of human trafficking earlier on. We do know in some cases, some of these poor souls are forced into this type of labor through violence and organized crime. How will you make sure that you're not criminalizing victims?
Yeah, I think the proper investigation and the cooperation by those that will be arrested, I think that's the only way in which you can be able to dissect which ones are doing it voluntarily and involuntarily. And I think, as we know, those that will be brought into the country, even if it's citizens. So we just need a proper policing and investigation, to crack down in terms of what is this, what's happening. And we know the kind of offenses that are related, not necessarily trafficking and the like, in respect of the communities that are suffering from. And I think the damage to the critical infrastructure is one of the concerns that we have to scale up the penalties.
Sure, but I mean, anybody could obviously lie and tell a sub story to investigators if they're caught in this way. And it also relies on police officers who themselves have fallen victim to being part of these networks and bribed to let people go. How are you going to make sure that this legislation doesn't just look good on paper, but that it actually delivers the outcomes you desire?
Yeah, I think the one of the things that we're doing, as an example, is that we are authorizing police to be able to do some of the inspections, but not necessarily as inspectors, not the full-scale inspection. So the training that is going to be given to the police officials, and I think part of the dedication of the police, so that these are specialized kind of policing, police, men and women, it will be able to go a long way in order to crack down on the challenges that we're facing.
At least 14 miners died in Ganeng last week in that mine collapse. How would this legislation prevent a tragedy like that?
Yeah, definitely, as I indicated, that the authorization of artisanal mining will then bring people into the, knowing that who are they're properly permitted, and the dangers of where they are mining obviously will be controlled. So that will go a long way in terms of making sure that people apply and go and do that artisanal mining properly.
All right. Advocate Tsietsi Sebelemetja is the Chief Director of Legislative Development at the Department of Justice and Constitutional Development.
Current events, developing stories,
Tough questions.
Your voice making a difference.
This is Breakfast with Bongani Bingwa.